My Mother's Bedtime Stories about Willie Mae. My mother used to tell the best stories at bedtime. Well, not only at bedtime, because she could pull a good one out of her hat just about any time of the day or night. She was a writer, and quite a good one, if I might say. She wrote a column for the local newspaper for over 25 years, having a weekly deadline and meeting them all, I believe. I suppose that's where I got my love for writing. My earliest memory is of her sitting at the kitchen table in this very house with a stenographer pad and pencil. She wrote about everyday events. The column was entitled Around Our Town. It was a regular thing to include details about someone's birthday party, baby shower, wedding, or church social, the latest news of who was dating whom, and a few helpful hints. She also wrote about the family. There are many references to our dear little girl, referring to yours truly, or big brother, referring to my brother Larry. She often wrote about the hunters in her family, my dad, uncles, and brother, who would head out on cool fall mornings dressed in coveralls and caps, with all of those pockets in them, and she would tell about the 5-point bucks they'd field dress, or the rows of quail laying on the picnic table to be plucked and cleaned. I still have every one of the articles she wrote tucked away for safekeeping upstairs in an old steamer trunk, and I dare say I could go back through them and tell you what color my birthday dress was when I was 7, or what kind of shoes my dad wore to work that year. But like I said, her talents went far and above the call of duty when it came to telling a story. Every night she would tuck me into bed with all of the big windows in this house open in the summer to let in the breezes that blew through the valley in the evenings. I recall hearing the whippoorwills and the tree frogs singing as she told me stories. In the late fall, I'd lie in bed and hear the fox and coon hunters out in the woods. Now, they weren't like the fox hunters you'd see in a portrait of merry old England. They weren't dressed in velvet jackets and riding boots. But we'd hear those dogs, and she'd go over and pull the curtains closed. Those old fox hunters are at it again, out there in the woods with their whiskey jugs and their no-good dogs chasing that poor little fox till it drops down dead. I remember how she'd tell me that, and I would pull the covers up over my head and listen to those dogs baying until the sound blended with my dreams, most of the time, dreams about a frightened little fox. In winter, we'd lie in bed together, and she'd tell me tales about hobos coming in off the highway or off the train, hiding out in barns and seeking open doors to come in from the cold. She told me stories about ghost lights in the cemetery, and that when she was a little girl, the panthers who lived in the hills and the valleys would scream like a woman in fear. But the story I loved to hear her tell the best was the one we had both experienced when I was just big enough to ride a toddler's pushcar around inside the house. If all the doors were open, then I could ride in a big circle, first through the kitchen and then into the dining room and into the den, and from there into the long hallway, past several doors, around to the big staircase that led upstairs. This is how she told the story. It was on a rainy afternoon when you were just a little thing riding that pushcar around in the house until it almost drove me crazy. You were riding round and round and round, and I was trying to read the newspaper in the kitchen when I heard you stop riding. Now, any time you got quiet, I had to worry, because you could sure get into something in the drop of an instant. So, just as I'm about to go and see what you're doing, you come riding into the kitchen on that little pushcar and look up at me. "Mama," you say, "who is that lady on the stairs?" I've seen her many times since that day, on the same step as I saw her then, a rather tall woman with reddish-brown hair. Her clothes were very old-fashioned. She had on a plaid blouse with a high-button collar and long sleeves with ruffles at the cuff of her wrists. In one hand, she held a scrub brush, and in the other, a wooden bucket, and there was the smell of soap. On that day when I asked my mother who the lady was, I'll never forget how she snatched me up and ran from one door that led to the hall to the next in the dining room to the next in the den, locking them all shut. She said, "I took you back to the kitchen and gave you something to drink and tried to tell you that it was time for lunch, but you kept asking me why I'd locked the doors. So as best I could, I told you, that's your great-granny Lizzie." "Does she live here?" I asked. "In a way," my mother replied. There was just no way for a grown woman to tell a 3-year-old what a ghost was, but if she had, I believe I would have understood. As I grew older, I asked her about Lizzie again, and she denied that the event of that afternoon had ever occurred. But I knew she had remembered, and I knew what I had seen. "Then why did you lock the doors that day?" I'd keep asking her. And she'd always say why anyone could just wander in off the road. When my mother was elderly, she lived on here until a year before she passed away. And in those last years, she would often tell me, "I saw Lizzie today on the stairs. She likes to keep the place clean, you know." And then there was no doubt that what I remembered from my childhood was true. Another story she told me was about the gypsies. She said they used to travel along the highway in the spring and late summer, following the gathering of crops in this region or another, picking tomatoes on Chandler Mountain or corn on Sand Mountain or tobacco to the east in the Carolinas. She said when she first married my dad and moved here, she didn't quite believe the stories they told her about the gypsies. Grandmother Lizzie used to tell her that women hated it when the gypsies came to town because they'd always set up camp down across the railroad beside the Blue Spring. She said their wagons were like little wooden houses on wheels, brightly painted, colored with designs on them. She said they'd park their wagons in a ring just like on Wagon Train, and in the center of the ring they would build a big bonfire, and at night fiddlers would play and women would dance, twirling their silk skirts and scarves around and around. They used to bring all sorts of wines and potions and liquor with them, and they would make an outright man lose his senses. You know, they've been known to steal jewelry and food, and why, I even heard they kidnapped children, Grandma Lizzie had told her. And for some reason, they would often stop under the big shade trees out front of this house. And that unnerved my mother. When they were here, she said she kept all the windows and doors locked up tight, even on the hottest day. And all the women at the church hid their jewelry and kept their husbands under lock and key. But they had been following this route for as long as the highway had been passable. The gypsies never stayed in one place too long, arriving in their camp only to disappear into thin air by morning. They were what Mother called swarthy people, with dark skin and eyes and jet black hair. Most of them couldn't speak English, she said, and you never could understand what they wanted. "One hot August day before you were born," she told me, "your brother was just a little thing and he was outside playing in the yard. I was watching him out the side door and saw that he was busy with his toys. And I only turned around for a couple of seconds to stir what was on the stove. I looked out the door again and your brother was gone. His toys were where he had left them, but he was not," she whispered as if ashamed. "So I wiped my hands on my towel and raced outside calling to him everywhere, but he didn't answer. And then I saw those gypsies parked out in front of the house in their wagons, and I tell you, my heart went into my throat. There were 3 trucks out there with the wagon houses built on the beds, and a whole group of them were milling about the front yard, and I ran toward them calling for your brother. There were several children in that group running around out there, and there was a woman about my age who walked up to me with a baby in her arms. She was asking me something. I couldn't understand as I strained to get past her to the wagons, calling your brother's name. And just as I was about to start screaming for help, a woman came around the back of one of the wagons with your brother's hand in hers, and she brought him to me. "This one is not mine," the woman said, smiling, and I snatched him up into my arms, and she laughed. "I found him with the other boys, and I did not recognize him," she said. The woman asked me for some water to bathe the children, and I showed her the spigot in the backyard. Then I carried your brother back into the house and told him never to walk away like that again. I gave him some milk and cookies. We watched the little procession of children and mothers lining up to bathe in the cool spring water. They stayed in the backyard until the late afternoon sun began to fade. Then I heard a knock on my kitchen door and went to find the woman who had returned your brother to me. "Here is something for your kindness," the woman said, and passed a beautiful silken scarf into my hands. I thanked her and watched them walk away. I thought to myself, maybe Grandmother Lizzie was wrong after all.